Hi and welcome to CLIU's Ready PD Series Literacy Love. My name is Amanda David and I'm an educational consultant here at the IU. Today we will be talking about scaffolding in the virtual setting and how you can best support your students virtually. Here are today's goals. I'll briefly go over these and then we'll get started. So by the end of this presentation, you should be able to differentiate between scaffolding, accommodating, and modifying. You will be able to exhibit the understanding of scaffolding as well as indicate the skills needed to be successful during virtual instruction. You'll identify the 4 categories of virtual scaffolding and identify ways to scaffold and support metacognition virtually. You'll be able to determine how reflection strategies supports metacognition. And lastly, you will choose strategies by the end of this presentation to support scaffolding in your own virtual setting. When we talk about scaffolding, sometimes the terms accommodation and modification comes into the conversation. They're not the same. So here are the differences really quick. Scaffolding is when you temporarily support your students by helping them achieve a learning goal, and then you eventually take those supports away to ensure that they can complete the task on their own. For accommodation, you're impacting how a student learns. So it's the same content as the other students, but the vehicle on how they get there is different. So this may be extended time, verbal directions, as opposed to written, chunking tasks, and so on. Modification is when you're changing the actual content or the standard. A modification may be found in a student's IEP, for example. I love this graphic about scaffolding. So this is just kind of explaining what scaffolding should be. So on the one side of this graphic, you have a student staring at this learning goal or outcome, and the student has no means to get to that outcome and is clearly alarmed. How am I going to get there? On the other side, you see scaffolding in place, and it's just like scaffolding in a building. So with the scaffolding on the other side, the learning activities as well as the feedback and assessment become key in attaining that outcome. Some things that we should keep in mind when we're talking about scaffolding is that it should be sensitive to students' strengths and needs. It should be standards driven and align with the learning objectives. It should be applicable to the process of meeting those learning objectives and should be used to give students the necessary supports to complete the task. Otherwise wouldn't be possible. And it should be appropriate to the task and respectful to all learners. So we're not putting scaffolding in place just to do it or to say, oh yes, I'm differentiating. No, there has to be meaning behind the scaffolding to ensure that your students are able to attain the learning objective that you have in place. Can't talk about scaffolding without talking about zone of proximal development. So let's go back to those undergrad days really quick and just touch upon zone of proximal development. So you have your circles. A in the center are the things that your learners can do on their own without assistance or support. The big circle on the outside where B is the things that your students can't do even with support. So if you have a 3rd grade math student, you are not going to be doing, pre-algebra concepts or even some 4th grade content. That's the outside step. That zone of proximal development is in between the two, which are the things that your learners can do but need some support. We've heard of scaffolding before, just like I just mentioned. Something that we at times forget as teachers is that not all scaffolding will work the same way for everyone. So there are some skill sets that students require on the virtual realm that they don't necessarily need to have in person. When we're talking about students working virtually, there are some skills. So the student needs to have self-confidence, so having a strong conviction of oneself. Self-efficacy, which there is a difference between self-confidence and self-efficacy. When we're talking about that, we're talking about the person's belief that they can be successful at a specific task or a range of tasks. So the difference between the two is that you can be very confident as a person and be confident that you're going to fail or be confident that this is going to work or just have that strong feeling. That's confidence. But when you're talking about efficacy, it is talking about being successful, being effective. So that is the big difference between the two, is that we're talking about success. And a student needs to be self-directed in order to be successful with online learning. They need to be able to navigate through their content partially independently, being able just to go on and power up their Chromebook. They need to have that directedness. When you have in-person instruction, sometimes you're not as reliant on those skills because there is an educator in the room who is really putting forth a lot of that scaffolding in person. So you'll have that student who's, off task and you'll tap on their desk, or you'll be able to really bolster a student's confidence in a positive way that will drive them to that self-efficacy. You're missing those personal components when you're talking about virtual instruction. So if you have someone who is struggling with the 3 listed skills, there's a good chance that they are going to struggle in the virtual setting. Specific scaffolding can be put in place to help those who struggle. The Wiley Learning Institute is one of the leading groups of online learning platforms, and they have done a lot of studying regarding scaffolding. So you'll notice I'm referencing a lot to a lot of their research and material. But according to the Wiley Learning Institute, there are 4 types of scaffolding in the virtual classroom. We're going to go over those now. The first one being procedural scaffolding. This is pretty much helping your students navigate the content itself. It's what you probably do first during any and all of your instruction. So you're going to front load expectations. You're going to give the resources. This allows your students to know what's expected of them and requires you to interact with your students. And when the students know what to expect, they in turn feel safe within their learning environment. You have possibly syllabi or your discussion post protocols, classroom resources, even going onto Zoom and saying, all right, guys, here's what we're going to be doing today, and just kind of front loading what's going to be happening that day. Those are all procedural scaffolding examples. Strategic scaffolding is when you as the teacher guide and provide alternative ways for students to work through their learning hurdles. This may be to show different ways to solve an equation. It could be assigning student-specific pathways on an online learning program. So for those of you who are using different platforms, you may be doing a certain math standard, but being able to scaffold it based off of your students' abilities and learning styles. They may tackle that content a little differently based off of what they're doing in that learning platform and assign pathways. Having small groups in breakout rooms when you're on Zoom, so you can work through some problems together. Guiding questions and examples are also examples. That was a little redundant. You as the teacher, you need to be aware of your students' learning styles as well as preferences, in addition to having that frequent and meaningful communication with your students so you know exactly where they're at in their learning process. Conceptual scaffolding, I believe, is the one where we as teachers feel very comfortable with doing. It's when we help students decide what to consider in learning and guide them to those key concepts. Up on the slide here, you can see a list of examples. Discussion boards or announcements give the students a heads up on what's to come. I don't know about you, but when I've done my online coursework for my different certs and master's degrees, I oftentimes would go right to the discussion boards or the announcements because that's going to kind of give you a pretty good idea of what's going on. And then I pretty much determined, okay, I need to read these chapters or look at this article, and then I can do the discussion board, or then I'll be ready to write my reflection or write my paper. It kind of gave me the direction that I needed on what I needed to do for my online learning. The same goes for our students. So giving specific and appropriate feedback during Zoom conferences or in the little comment boxes you can do in your Google Docs or other assignment software are also examples. This type of scaffolding leads students to higher order thinking and also reduces the cognitive load. And graphic organizers and knowledge maps are big ones here. On the next slide, we'll just take a quick glance at some graphic organizer examples and how they support higher order thinking. So we have different types of information that we are to go through with our graphic organizer on the left-hand side, and then on the right are the specific examples. I'm not going to read them word for word because you all are smart people. So I'm not going to sit here and read it all to you. But you'll notice that it's the higher order thinking verbs that you're going to be seeing here and the types of organizers on the right. Using these within your Google Classroom or whatever platform you're using allows students to kind of navigate their learning. Metacognitive scaffolding. So this is the last category, and this is when the student is guided within the thinking process and you help with that self-evaluation or self-assessment piece. This promotes student independence, and really at the end of the day, that's our goal, right? We want our students to be going through their content and being able to be independent with what we're teaching them. So in essence, metacognitive scaffolding pushes our students to be independent and self-reflective learners. When we have this skill set as learners, we're going to be more successful in the virtual setting. Within metacognitive scaffolding, there are 3 categories within that as well. There's planning, monitoring, and evaluation. Students and teachers engage within each of these together with the hope that towards the end, students will be reaching that independent piece. So with planning, there's the establishment of learning goals, as well as, sorry, my screen's a little small. I'm having trouble reading. There we go. Establish of learning goals, planning to achieve those goals, development of strategies for effective learning, as well as management. An example would be course learning goals. So in the beginning of the year, the beginning of the semester, beginning of a chapter, you're going to go through and say, here are the things that we're going to learn about. This is what I want you to be able to do or complete by the end of this instruction. For monitoring scaffolding, that's when we're tracking learned progress as well as monitoring potential outcomes. Best example is going through assessment data with students. And I'll talk a little more about data conferencing, but that would be a great example of tracking your learning progress, whether it's with an online learning program or progress monitoring or just overall assessment data. That would be an example. For evaluation scaffolds, that's based on the results of planning and monitoring methods. You're allowing the learner opportunity to determine effective and non-effective processes, and the results may require revising or changing the learning strategy. So this would be feedback from your students. So if you are giving an end of quarter survey or at the end of your assessment, if you put, what was the most meaningful, what helped you the most in this chapter, or what have you. Getting that feedback from students and them being able to be mindful of what worked for them is going to allow you to best plan your instruction. Okay, so how do we get our students there to that point? There isn't a one size fits all or easy solution, I'm sorry to say. Different scaffolding is going to work differently with each of your students. You may have students, this group of students works really well with this, whereas others work better with this. It's all a matter of knowing your students. So reflection, that's the starting point of metacognition. So step 1 being, begin your reflection where students are, okay? Some students may be able to kind of think back to themselves and evaluate, where others have no idea where to start. Step 2 is you're providing scaffolding to support your students' ability to engage in that reflection. So it's almost like scaffolding within scaffolding. And then step 3 is giving students the freedom to tinker with different modes of reflection so they can find what works best for them. When we begin with where our students are, there's a couple things you need to remember. Self-evaluation is hard for adults. Think about yourself after you have a lesson and maybe it didn't go the way you wanted it to. It's uncomfortable. It's sometimes disheartening, sometimes it's a struggle. If it's a struggle for us, there's a good chance it's going to be a struggle for our students. So it's essential to be patient, and it's essential to be ready to guide and support, and that this will take time, and that's okay. You need to be able to set clear expectations and guidance, as I said, as well as making sure that everyone is on the same page with the lesson or activity goals. Not necessarily the content, but the goals. Does everyone understand what you are hoping to achieve by the end of this instruction? That needs to be shared and bought in by all of your students. So as I said, it's like scaffolding within scaffolding. You are going to guide your students on how to reflect. So modeling is key. When you are rolling out reflection pieces and devices, it is important that you are modeling what this looks like, sounds like, all of it, okay? When you are going through reflection, and if you're at the starting points especially, there are the 5 R's that will really help you roll this out to your students. So recall, it is what it is. Recalling what happened that day, just kind of I was about to say reflecting, going back and just doing like a recap almost. Recapturing. So that's when we're talking about emotions, accomplishments, and challenges. So this is going with the emotional piece that will help students look back and remember, is what that emotion tied to it. What made you feel incredibly frustrated? Let's talk about why that made you feel frustrated. You felt really accomplished at this point. What was it about it that made you feel accomplished? Relating. So identifying connections to previous content or instruction. Remember back when we did X, Y, and Z? Well, we're going to be bringing that skill back out of the closet and we're going to be doing this, those sorts of things. Rationalizing. So looking at patterns and creating personal meaning, finding ways to make this relevant to the student and having that be the reflective piece. And then redirecting. So thinking about the future. How can you use this in your future endeavors? When it comes to reflection, freedom is essential. Like I said, it's not a one size fits all. This is where a lot of teachers who are using these strategies are using menus or surveys and things of that nature to see what students prefer, because reflection is personal. So the vessel needs to be personal as well. What is going to be most effective for the student? So some examples might be mind maps, journaling, surveys, videos, podcasts. It might even be a combination. Someone might do a mind map within their journal. Someone might video record themselves doing the mind map or the podcast. Some other metacognitive strategies. So I wanted to touch upon some of these really quick, because there's nothing worse than going to a training and someone throwing things at you and then you not having anything to take back with you. So a lot of these are ones that I have personally used myself as a teacher that I wanted to share. So the first one being data conferencing. Whether I taught first grade or fifth grade or middle school, data conferencing was something that I utilized a lot. This is when I would pull benchmarking data or just overall assessment data, and we would take a look at it together one-on-one and discuss what's going on. Okay, it looks as though with the breakdown of this assessment, you did really well with that. What are your thoughts on this topic area? And having that conversation with the student, talking about their weaknesses. And together we would set a goal for the next time we had an assessment. And along with that goal, what action steps needed to be taken by the student and by myself. Each of my students had their own data conferencing folder in which we would both take notes and documents so that we were in this together. Granted, this was in person, but things that you could do similarly online, breakout rooms, student conferences through Zoom, having just a Google Doc that you guys are going back and forth with when a student is goal setting. Self-tracking. So when I taught second grade and first grade learning support, my students had their own data folder and we would go over progress monitoring together. After we did a probe, students would actually graph on their own with guidance their progress. So if we were going over sight word identification, they would graph how their increase or decrease was. And afterwards, we would talk about why things were the way they were. And sometimes they, straight up would say, I really didn't practice this week beyond what we did in class. Okay, what do we need to do next week then? Conversations like that are going to allow the student to really be aware of themselves and their progress. Having dialogue about assignments via comments in Google Docs. That's something many of us have used in the virtual setting. Being able to have that back and forth with students is really helpful when you're going through tasks and learning goals together. The Kaizena feedback app, it's a Google Chrome add-on that you could hop on there, and it allows you to have dialogue back and forth with your students. Having a self-evaluation with a rubric, you could do this through Google Forms, you could do it through a PDF that's editable, you can do it through a Google Doc. There are different ways you can have that self-evaluation piece that students can do together, and you would use a lot of the reflection questions that I have on the next slide to help students think about that. Having guided questions via discussion board or Google form. Like I said, I'll have some questions in just a minute. So I'll leave this screen up for a minute in the event that you want to take a screenshot or take a picture. So I won't read all of these to you because there are a lot, but there are some reflection questions that you can propose to your students to help them engage in self-reflection and therefore help with their metacognition and being aware of their learning journey. Some of it is pretty lower level thinking, like, what did I learn today? But there are ones that kind of dig a little deeper. And some of my favorites are, what process did I use to ensure that I remained on task, especially if you have a student who's been really struggling with that. What was the most enjoyable part about this lesson? Least enjoyable? How could the activity be improved? That was one that I really liked a lot. It helps with that final category of metacognition, helps you kind of evaluate your instruction and how things can be better for the students and for you. So for the rest of the month, we have some awesome PD coming up, and I wanted to shamelessly plug what we have. Next week, we will be having reading strategies where we'll talk about different strategies that you can utilize, as well as on the 23rd, we have analysis. And on the 25th, you will see me again for supporting struggling readers. If you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. My information is up on the screen. Again, my name is Amanda David. I am with Carbon Lehigh Intermediate Unit Tech, educational consultant with special programs. So thank you very much. Have a great day and stay safe. Bye-bye.